Now to the 2020 presidential race. Senator Elizabeth Warren is heading to Puerto Rico today, where she will take part in a conversation about the island's recovery from Hurricane Maria. She's the second presidential hopeful to visit the island following fellow Democrat Julian Castro. Tomorrow, Warren heads to South Carolina. Well, two other potential presidential candidates have already visited the state this week. Neither Senator Bernie Sanders nor Cory Booker have announced that they are running, but both took part in Martin Luther King Jr. Day events on Monday. Well, Sanders continues his swing through South Carolina today. Well, the big newspapers in the states are taking notice, and the Post-Courier's cover reads this: presidential race gets head start in South Carolina. The Beaufort Gazette reads, Booker, Sanders evoke MLK's vision while courting South Carolina's black voters. Joining me now, Democratic strategist Basil Smikle. He's a former director of the New York State Democratic Party and also a lecturer at City University of New York. Basil, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
You were telling me in commercial break, people have forgotten that South Carolina was actually, just with the black vote in general, President Obama didn't do well initially.
He was polling in the single digits until we got to South Carolina in the primary cycle. So for a good part of 2007, when he announced going into 2008, there were a lot of black voters that were still very up in the air with respect to his candidacy. But he won Iowa, and then as the primary went to South Carolina, some unfortunate comments by Bill Clinton turned everybody's attention to that state. It's important because the majority of the electorate is African American, and when he won South Carolina, you had a lot of black voters say, okay, this is our guy.
It's so interesting. You reminded us of that history, but remind us again, why do you think South Carolina is so important for these Democratic hopefuls so early on?
Again, because of the majority African-American electorate among primary voters, it can be viewed as a litmus test for how you'll do in the African-American community broadly, but also a couple of other things. This cycle is starting very early because there are probably going to be 1,000 candidates on the Democratic side this year, so people want to get started really early. In terms of raising money, in terms of building their staffing. And again, because it's a southern state with a heavy African-American presence, it's a good way to sort of engage also civil rights rhetoric and how you'll do in communities of color broadly.
I want to talk a little bit about Senator Kamala Harris. If you were to sort of game her options right now, her chances at this point, what are her positives and what are her negatives?
So what's interesting about Kamala Harris is that when you've seen her in the last year or so sort of thundering away in those Senate hearings, going after folks who have gone in for testimony, it has really showed her to be a leader in many respects. California, the state that she's from, has moved their primaries earlier in the process, so that actually can benefit her having an earlier primary, because that if she does very well in the state, if she wins that state, it gives her a bump going into the rest of the cycle. There are some who've questioned whether or not she's been a real fighter for civil rights because of her background as a prosecutor, which she touts. So I think some of that's going to come up, but I don't know how much that's going to resonate, especially because she has really good support among African-American men and women in particular, and is very popular and very good on the stump.
We're mentioning the black vote right now, but did they get out in the last two elections? What were their numbers, and do you think that this is a crucial voting bloc for the Democratic Party?
So certainly very, very high in Obama's first election, slightly lower in 2012. We saw certainly high turnout in the midterm elections, but not where we wanted it to be, quite frankly. But I understand that because Obama was not on the top of the ticket. What's the challenge in 2020 is whether or not any of these candidates can actually motivate communities of color to come out really strongly, particularly also in the Latino community. Are these communities going to come out when Obama is not at the top of the ticket and there's no African American at the top of the ticket or Latino? The concern has been, and some of the polling has suggested, that voters are looking at predominantly white male candidates as presidential contenders. That's going to be really concerning, and maybe for Kamala Harris and others.
In the groups of people of color, voters are looking at white male candidates?
Overall, Democratic voters in the primary have, in the polling, suggested that the white males like Biden, Beto, and others, those are the ones that are polling highest.
Wow.
And so the concern is, if you have a white male at the top of the ticket when all of these conversations are about over race, and immigration, what's that going to do in terms of motivating the electorate? So some of the other dialogue is whether or not someone like a Kamala Harris or Cory Booker are really running for the #2 spot as opposed to the #1 spot. But again, if you don't have the ability to create a social political movement around your candidacy, like Obama did, no matter who you are, it's going to be a problem for Democrats.
You know, we have such a wide array of reaching people now. It's not just through our television screens these days. What do you make of the way that these candidates, particularly the women who have come forward now, you know, Kamala Harris announced on a morning show, Gillibrand announced on a late night show, Tulsi Gabbard announced on CNN. What do you make of the platforms that they're choosing, and why do they decide to do what they do?
Well, remember what I was saying earlier, there are going to be 1,000 people in this race, and I think that's the product of the fact that folks are anticipating a very big primary season with tons of candidates. They want to get out early. They want to get out on the biggest platform that they possibly can. You've seen Beto, for example, do this sort of tour, and he's sort of Instagramming his dental appointments or what have you. So it's an opportunity for people to kind of come out and carve out their own space really, really early. And so that's what you're seeing. It's these big platforms really early in the cycle, try to get their name out there so that they could at least get a week of press to themselves.
So they really have not been aiming their firepower on each other at this point.
Correct.
What point do the Democratic gloves come off?
I think you'll start to see that towards the end of this year. Certainly, as we start to get into some of the debates, and you'll probably see that somewhere in the fall, closer to December. But and by then, hopefully, the candidate pool will thin out a bit. But I think around that time, you'll start to see the gloves come off. I'm not sure you're going to see similar sniping as as you saw in 2016 between Hillary and Bernie. But you'll have to see some differentiation. And again, I think towards December, you'll start to see that.
So meanwhile, Senator Cory Booker hasn't officially announced either way, whether he's in or out. But it was interesting. We caught a tweet that somebody sent to him saying, "Dear Senator Booker, will you be running for president in 2020? And he replied, "Just between you and me, I will let you know soon." Is that a pretty cryptic message? What do you think? Is he running?
I think within a week or two, you'll hear that he's going to run.
You do?
I do.
What are his chances?
You know, I like Cory Booker. The fact that he was a mayor, voters like executives. We don't often like legislators because their votes are kind of, you know, I voted for this and against that. You know, the sort of John Kerry approach from 2004. I voted for it before I voted against it. People like it, voters like executives because they can say, I did this and I did that. So coming from being mayor of Newark, I think he can go around and tout sort of how he's revitalized Newark. So that is a story that I think works particularly in urban areas, but also I think it works for rural areas as well in his ability to say, you know what, I know how to take marshal resources and put them to work, to put people to work, particularly around education. So he's got as good a shot as any, quite frankly, but I like the story and the narrative that he'll be able to tell.
You know, the great thing about politics is sometimes the person you think is going to win doesn't always end up winning.
I know.
Right, you do this very well.
I was there in 20tioning at the Javits Center crying my eyes out.
I wasn't referring to that. I was just saying in general. You know, in '92, Bill Clinton got the governor from Arkansas.
That's right.
Nobody really gave him a chance in the beginning. Right?
That's right. I even go back to Jimmy Carter. And in fact, the reason that Iowa gets so much attention now is because of Jimmy Carter, because no one gave him a chance. But he said, you know what, I'm going to spend all my time in Iowa, do some picnics, do some barbecues. And he actually carved out this really interesting niche for himself when he ran and then wound up winning. And so there is really no way to predict what's going to happen in this cycle, quite frankly. But what I've been telling folks is to let the voters decide. Let's not sort of prop anybody up too early because that's just the way to sort of elevate them and then have them be brought down later on.
Basil Smikle, tell me you'll come back on
set. I
set.
will be. I'm happy to.
We look forward to it. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.